What is up, guys? Welcome to another React documentation video. In this one, we're going to be going over section 4, components and props. Okay, so the question is, well, what is a component? So we've seen elements before, just like normal HTML elements, but what is a component? I mean, what does that mean, right? So components are an awesome way, and this is kind of what React is sort of built on top of, the really cool way to basically separate your UI into independent isolated pieces that are reusable, okay? And this is a core principle of React, and kind of what makes it so amazing is that you can separate different pieces of your application into smaller pieces that you can reuse throughout the application and also not repeat yourself, which is really cool. Okay, so there are two methods of making components. The first is a functional component. The second is a class-based component. This video is mostly going to focus on the functional components because that's what this section of the documentation focuses on the most, or only really. But I'm going to briefly show you how to make a class-based component as well, just a really simple high-level overview. And then in the next video or the next couple of videos is when we'll be diving more into that. I already created some files because this is now my third time making this video because it just is, unfortunately. But nevertheless, let's go over. I've created a func.js file. And also what's important to note when you're making these files or when you're making components in general is that components start with capital letters, whereas other files may not, or also HTML elements don't start with capital letters. Components do. I can't talk. Components do start with capital letters, both the file of the component as well as the component name itself. So let's start out by importing React from React, and then we will have a function. I'm using the old like ES5 syntax here for functions. The reason why is not because I don't know ES6, it's because actually the React documentation, for whatever reason, still does. In fact, it still uses the old syntax, and so that's just kind of what I've become accustomed to doing because I've been following along with the documentation. And then this also has to export this as a default. And this is going to take in props here, and then this will simply return, say not H1, H3, and we will say hello. Well, no, we're going to say hello, and then this will be props, dot name, and then we can use this right here in our app component by saying func. My IDE automatically imports that, so make sure that you import that right there. Func name equals Garrett, and now if we come over to here, right here, we can see that this is hello Garrett, right? We've seen this before, nothing new, okay? Now let's also do a class-based component, and we will import React from React. Here we will say class, and this will be class comp extends React.component, and then likewise we will export default class comp. And then inside of here, now without getting too into detail about this, because we're going to come back to more detail about class-based components, but instead of just returning something, we need to render it first. That's one of the methods that the class-based components use. So we're going to render, and then inside here we will return, and we will return an H2, and we will say welcome to, and then so this should be this. This is a difference between, one of the differences between class-based components and functional components is that when you refer to props, inside of a class-based component, it's not just props dot whatever like it was here, right there. Oops, it's this dot props dot company, for example. Now, here we will have, what was it, class comp. Also, don't forget to import that, and we will have, not that. We will have company will equal Google. And if we come over here, we get hello Garrett, welcome to Google. Awesome, so that works. And that's basically all we're going to be doing with the class-based components for this video. And the reason for that is, again, because this section of the documentation doesn't really focus on this right here. So let's go back to the functional components and just kind of walk through what we're doing here. I know in the video, in the React documentation, they kind of do it differently. They don't really introduce components until this point. I think I've already used components so far, but either way, basically components, they take in props, which stands for properties, and these are static bits of information that you want to pass into your component for it to use. It can be anything you want. It can be as simple as just text, or it can be a whole function that you're actually going to use as a callback function, let's say on some sort of event that gets triggered or something like that, which we'll be going into event handling in 2 videos. So we're not going to talk about that right now, but you can pass in literally whatever you want for props. Also, it's important to note that these two components, rather, as far as React is concerned, they're basically the same, at least right now they are. They might not be in the future. I'm not totally sure about that one, but right now they're basically the same. They do the same thing. They just output some text. And the main difference is that, you know, class-based components have some additional features you might have heard of, like state, for example, lifecycle hooks, although I think that functional components now have lifecycle hooks or something like that. So those we'll be going into in later videos. So let's really quickly just walk through what is going on right here. Obviously, we've seen here that we can use, actually, let's get rid of this just for this video because we're not really using them right now. I just want to briefly show you guys how it works. We've seen in this, in React, that we can use normal HTML elements like that, right? Nothing wrong about that, works perfectly. Obviously, we've already demonstrated that you can use your own things, right? And so what happens is that by things, that made sense in my head, sorry. You can use your own names for components like this. I mean, func is definitely not an HTML element, especially not with a capital F. So you can use your own things and kind of make them up as you please. And what happens is that when React sees it, it passes those attributes, the props, to that component, right? And it does so as a single object, which I think we've seen in the last video where it passes the props, or I think it was the last video, where it passes the props to that object because it basically just becomes, like the whole thing just becomes an object in React's view. And then it basically just, one of the properties on that object is this props object, right? And so what's happening here is that we are setting up this function and we're saying, okay, give us some props, right? And we're saying that every time this function is used, which we're using it here, we're going to create an H3 that says hello, and then it's going to take whatever is passed in inside of this props. We're expecting that one of those things is going to be the name property. So pass in or use whatever the value is for the name property. And then here in the app component, we're saying, okay, let's use that func component or that func function. And then for that name property, because we know that it's expecting one, pass in this. Or I don't actually think I don't think you're required to use it. Yeah, you're not required to use it, but so it's not that it's like expecting it in the sense that it needs it, but it has the availability to use it if you so choose. So we're saying, hey, this component has the name availability for a property. Let's pass something in for that, right? And it kind of just looks like an attribute when we are using it here. Now, also important to note is that this doesn't have to be plain text. If I had something up here, for example, like, can I use let? Yeah, I can. If I had something here, like, I think I can also use const, right? Yeah. Const name, or if this was, let's say, const username, and this equaled Garrett. Actually, I'll change it just so you can see that this does in fact change. Right? I could put in like this. I could say username, and that would work just the same. Now we get Jake, right? So you don't have to pass in strings there. You can pass in literally whatever you want. And like I mentioned before, you could pass in a function as a callback function if you wanted to for like event handling or something like that. Totally fine. React lets you do it. So So props are definitely something that are pretty powerful, right? Now, let's say that we wanted to reuse this thing. I don't know, let's say that, you know, we have 4 users, and I will also have this be users, and then maybe this is an array instead. And then we have Jake, whoops. We have Garrett, we have Trish, and we have Rachel, but Rachel spelled correctly, right? So what we could do is we could say user 0, right? And we could replace all these. Let's say this is 1, this is 2, and this is 3. So now we have this, and we can use a component as many times as possible, wherever we want, doesn't really matter, right? The next thing that I want to show you, also really quick to mention is that in this case, because we're just kind of playing around with React, and because my entire whatever we're building here is React, we have one app component at the very top that was created automatically from Create React App when we started this project. But then we could also have, you know, as many components inside of there as we want to so that we can make our application. But if you were integrating React into an already existing app or solution or website or whatever you're doing, you don't have to do that. We have a bottom or a top-down approach because we're starting with React, all encompassing our entire application's React. But if you just wanted to slowly integrate React, you might want to start from the bottom up. So for example, you might want to start with, okay, this one button here in my application is going to be React, or this paragraph tag is going to be React, or this picture is going to be React, you know, so on and so forth, until perhaps, you know, whatever level of integration you're kind of going for and that you feel comfortable with. And you might actually one day get to the point where you want everything to be React inside of your app component. But you don't have to start with an app component. It can be very small, and you can integrate it however you really want to. Okay, so let's remove all of these, and we will also remove this, and we'll go back to just kind of having this be like that, or with the name as text, right? Don't need that. Now what we're going to do is, let's say that we had a bigger component here, okay? Let's say that we had some other stuff here, like we had this, and, you know, we have like a paragraph that has some lorem text here, and it's not just some, it's lots of lorem text there. And then we have, you know, a button here that says click me, right? What is the issue here? Parsing, okay. And then here, whoops. Okay, so we have this, right? Nothing crazy, but we have 4 different things here going on. Let's say that this button here, though, this click me button, is something that we use throughout our application. So we don't want it to just be right there because we're going to need it elsewhere. We need buttons all over the place, right? I mean, buttons are a pretty common thing that you use in your application. And so what we can do is, and this is actually encouraged by React, it is literally a very prominent part of the components and props section of the documentation, extracting components, and they go on to suggest that you should be, you know, extracting smaller components from large components, even down to just buttons or images or avatars or whatever it is. So what we're going to do is I've already created this because I already tried doing this and it had an issue, but we're going to import from import React from React. This will be a function called button that takes in the props, right? And then we will export default button, and then here we will return a button that doesn't actually do anything. Totally fine. But what we will do is we will just have inside of here props.text. Okay? And now inside of here, what we're going to do is we can actually get rid of this button. We don't need it anymore, right? What we're going to do now is we're going to say button, and we're going to make sure that's imported, right? Make sure that's imported at the top. And we have a property called text, so we're going to have some text that says learn more. Okay? Now our button says learn more, right? And also, just to show that we can now use this wherever we want, we will add button here and say text is button 2, right? And now we have this learn more, this button 2, and they're not in the same place. What we've done is we created a super simple React component for a button component that we can use wherever we want in the application, and we can pass in whatever we need through props. So for example, we've only We've only passed in what it's actually going to say, but we could also pass in, again, an event handler that goes and, calls a function somewhere else to go and actually, run whatever click we want, right? We can do kind of whatever we want. So definitely something that is very important to understand. The last thing that I want to talk about is, and also, by the way, really quickly, extracting components from larger components like that will also help to keep your application maintainable and understandable, which go hand in hand. But it'll really help a lot in terms of creating and building applications, especially if maybe you're doing things, if you're doing things by yourself and also in work where other people have to look at your code, it'll just make things a lot more easier and enjoyable, and so it's very important to do that. Something else I want to talk about is that props are read-only, and the reason that I'm going to show this through the documentation and not actually doing this myself is that this isn't actually something to like a React thing to code. This is more of a JavaScript thing. Is that React doesn't have very many rules. It's not very opinionated like Angular, for example. When you want to learn Angular, you have to learn TypeScript and JavaScript, and then you actually have to learn Angular on top of that. And that's a massive undertaking. React, not really like that. It's pretty simple, very unopinionated. But there are a couple rules that are pretty strict. One of them being that props are read-only, okay? So what does that mean? That basically means that you can't mutate them, okay? A function, and this is called a pure function. The function takes in arguments. In this case, for example, it takes in A and B, and then it returns a value based on those arguments. That's a pure function because you're not mutating the arguments. You're simply returning a new value or a new value based on those arguments, and that's totally fine. However, this here, which is an impure function, would be if we took in 2 arguments and then still use those 2 arguments to calculate something, or maybe not in this case, but we mutated part of or one of those arguments, okay? In this example here, we take in account and amount, and we are changing what the account argument equals depending on the second argument. That's improper. Don't do that in React with props, okay? It's very strict about that. If you want to mutate things or basically have values changing and dynamically react to, events that are going on in your application, that's totally fine. You can do that, but we're going to do that with something else called state, which we're going to learn about in the next video instead of mutating props. Okay, so that is it for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, do give me a thumbs up and subscribe. I do apologize. I was pretty tired, so if I said something that didn't really make sense or whatever, I'm pretty tired. But also, if you guys think you have any suggestions on how I can make these videos better, please let me know down below in the comments, and I would love to hear your feedback. So thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care. Bye-bye.